Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. The last few years have seen courageous sexual assault survivors become heroines and heroes, conquering the forces that have silenced them for so long. While laws are changing and we continue to unravel the cultural shame that has protected perpetrators and punished survivors, in this panel we ask, how can we evolve the conversation? Will we ever get to the heart of the matter and begin to think of a world without rape? Historian Joanna Bourke, investigative journalist Jess Hill, advocate Saxon Mullins, and Indigenous activist Bronwyn discuss how we can speak differently about rape and how it affects our understanding of gender, relationships, race, and community. This is the FODI 2022 panel discussion chaired by author Sisonke Msimang, World Without Rape. Please note this session contains themes that may be sensitive to some listeners, including discussions of rape and sexual assault.
So my name is Sisonke and I am moderating this panel, and it is going to be a pleasure to be in conversation with these women, and we're glad you all turned up. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to greet the elders in my own language, isiZulu, by saying Sanibonani, and paying my respects, as we say in isiZulu, Siyahlonipha, we respect you and we greet you. I'd like to start by introducing the panel for today, and I'll begin on my extreme left, probably politically as well as technically. Bronwyn is a Wiradjuri woman who has worked all her life for equality and the recognition of First Nations people and their rights. She has spent 30 years at the Mujigal Aboriginal Women's Centre based in Redfern on Abercrombie Street. She's a member of Domestic Violence New South Wales Aboriginal Working Party. She's also the director of New South Wales Women's Legal Service and the Aboriginal Women's Network. Welcome.
Thank you.
Joanna Bourke is a historian, an academic, and a professor of history at Birkbeck, University of London, and a fellow of the British Academy. She is also the Gresham Professor of Rhetoric. She's a principal investigator at a Wellcome Trust-funded project entitled Shame, Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. She's a prize-winning author of 14 books, 100 articles. She must be exhausted, and we are very happy to have her here. Jess Hill is a Walkley-award winning investigative journalist who has been reporting on domestic abuse for several years. In 2019, she published her first book, See What You Made Me Do, which was game-changing, I think, for the conversation here in Australia about the phenomenon of domestic abuse. It was awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. It's been shortlisted for several others, including the Walkley Book Award, the Prime Minister's Literary Prize, and on and on and on. In 2021, Jess adapted it into a television series, and she is currently a specialist gender violence reporter for Primer and is working on a 3-part series on consent for SBS. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks.
And Saxon Mullins is Director of Advocacy at Rape and Sexual Assault Research and Advocacy, RASARA. In 2018, Saxon appeared on Four Corners episode, I'm That Girl, in which she gave up her anonymity to tell the story of her 2013 sexual assault and the subsequent criminal trials and appeal process. The Four Corners episode led to the Attorney General asking the New South Wales Law Reform Commission to review and eventually change the section of the New South Wales Crimes Act that deals with consent in relation to sexual assault, demonstrating that speaking up really does make a difference. Thank you so much, Saxon. So in the last few years, globally, the Me Too movement has been the latest round in a surge of these conversations that continue to spring up in terms of activism around rape and sexual violence. And in Australia, at a national level, the issue of sexual violence has dominated headlines. The experiences of women like Brittany Higgins and Grace Tame, experiences like those of Saxon, have really highlighted what it is that this country has to deal with. And of course, at the same time, I can't think of a single name of an Indigenous woman with a similar story who has the kind of media recognition that we have for those white women's stories. Because there's, I think, a virtual media silence because of how the media reflects the biases of this society, which means that either Black women are never raped or Black women aren't worthy of the coverage. So part of what I want to do in this conversation is to have a conversation that can center both what we really need to talk about as well as some of the silences about what we need to talk about. So if we want a world without rape, which is what we're here to talk about, then I hope we can begin by speaking about it differently. Everyone on this panel has demonstrated absolutely the capacity to speak about sexual violence and rape in a way that is different from the norm, and that's precisely why we are all here to engage. So, thank you so much, and welcome to this conversation. I'm going to start by reading out a quote from Joanna's book. Her latest book is this it, Joanna? I've been reading the second one. Yeah, I've been reading the, sorry, it's Disgrace. Yes, I've been reading the PDF copy, so I don't actually know what the book looks like. So Joanna's latest book, Disgrace, and there's this great quote in there. There are many great quotes, and one of them, she writes, is, "Any assumption that sexual violence is a universal experience insults the specificities of individual histories. Terror is always local." So I want us to begin by asking a question, and I'll start with you, Bronwyn. How do you define sexual violence, and how do you think about sexual violence, particularly in the context of your community?
Right. Well, I can't really talk upon this subject without starting, the first contact and the horrific sexual violence that Aboriginal women experienced during those times. There is a line of Aboriginal people living today for whom that is their history. I'm not saying that every relationship was through sexual violence, but when you consider that at that time, and until quite recently, Aboriginal people were considered the fauna of the country, the flora and fauna of the country, before we became recognised as human beings, then perhaps that can give you some sort of snapshot of how Aboriginal women were considered and treated. Are we back?
Yay!
Yay, we are.
All right. So you were responding, Bronwyn, to the question of sexual violence and the context of Aboriginal history.
Yes. I was only reflecting that I'd need a long time if I was to start back there. But I would like to just to talk a little bit about the silence that covers, whether it be domestic family violence, but in particular sexual assault for Aboriginal women. We all know what the questions are, how women are viewed, how being told, my joke about our fault is really a very serious thing when it comes to sexual assault. How we dress, how we behave is under examination. Somehow there's a silence that speaks really loudly that Aboriginal women are less deserving of the protection of the law, are less deserving of the protection of others, of the community, that we somehow are not human. The whole concept of Aboriginal women, black velvet, Aboriginal women being extra sexual, more sexual active. I don't know if this is a concept that young Australians understand. It's certainly concepts from our generations and not very long ago. That somehow Aboriginal women were more available, and the violence extended from being state violence, from police, from institutions, through to Aboriginal women on the street. When I grew up, a little place called Brungle. It's between Gundagai and Tumut in beautiful Wiradjuri country up north. Even in my childhood, we'd be all called in because there'd be white men driving around the perimeter. And the fear or the understanding of the people that lived there, of the 10 or so houses, was that white men could grab a woman and rape her, or a child. I'm 70 years old, so this is in my lifetime. This was a conversation about if you stayed long in town, you went as a group, you came back as a group because of your fear of rape. The aspect of a man standing in front of me today brings back those type of memories. The actual physical fear of a man standing, towering over me, and I know these scenarios is used quite a lot in the fear of violence. But I think beyond that is fear of violation of your body, because that is humans' greatest fear. I'm thinking about not too long ago, in the last few years, and it was all over the news, and I'm not going to mention her name, but I'd just like to acknowledge an Aboriginal woman who died on a beach on the north coast. There was no charge of murder or rape. It was noted that she had engaged in sexual activity. She was there with two men. One was a part-time partner and his mate. She was there with two men, and that she'd had recently had sexual activity, and she was dead. Charges initially were not laid. Investigations did not take place. What does sexual assault look like to us today? I think it looked that much different to what it did when the first people came to this country. And if you go back in history and read some of that history, particularly around the Northern Territory and North Australia, because I think prior to that, the history of New South Wales is not as well documented because probably books and writings wasn't as happening as much. But I think if you go back through that history, and you can actually read accounts, of course, also at that time, rape and the domination of women was used as a tool of war. And even though they say Australia was settled, not conquered, this is all the evidence that Australia was in a war and conquered. Today we still have fear of sexual violence and that there's no redress for it. And I think that's a fear that women have throughout the world. Let's leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, it's a good start. Thank you. Saxon, I'll come to you and ask that same question. How do you think about sexual violence and what it means in the context of your community?
I think of sexual violence in the typical standard way of a violation, but I think of it in that way also in a community context. You know, I was violated. Through that violation, my family was violated, my friends were violated. My community around me felt that violation in a similar way to how I felt it. So, you know, as much as it happened to me, it happened to those around me. And so I think that word just encapsulates it entirely. It was a violation, but bigger than those two people at that moment.
Which echoes exactly what Bronwyn's just said about a collective sense that the violation occurs to one woman's body, but it actually it's a bigger hurt that's going on.
Absolutely.
Jess, how do you think about this in your community?
Yeah, well, I mean, over the last few years, my community has become largely people who have been subjected to intimate partner violence. And they've become my friends, and they've become my teachers, and the way that I tend to define it, obviously the word violation is inescapable, and violation of bodily autonomy through sexual means. What I think has come up particularly through my interactions with people who have been coerced and who have been groomed is the manufacturing of consent, where one can give what appears to be consent, but when they have been subjected to a process of thought reform, which is what grooming and coercive control and other things are, where it starts to get even murkier. Making this series on consent, one survivor described it as her physical safety, the idea of her body being a safe place has been taken away. And you can't get away from yourself. You can avoid going down dark alleys, you can all those sorts of tropes, but you can't escape yourself. And so for me, I come to this work as someone who, like pretty much any woman alive, it would seem, has experienced what could be broadly described as some kind of sexual violence or sexual harm. But I don't have an overt incident in my life history. But it's incredible as I sit with other victim survivors and hear their stories, how many moments come in to my mind of sexual harm, and I look at how I constrain myself in response to that, certain things that I might not do, certain ways I might not be with other people, and the memory of that lives in you. So that's just my personal interaction, which is so intricately, tied up with the professional that it's sort of hard to separate.
Disentangle. Thanks, Jess. So Joanna, I've saved this question for you last, because in your book you do this very overarching definition of what sexual violence is. But I'll start, as I have with everybody, at a personal level. How do you define sexual violence, and what does it mean for your community, and how do you define community?
I think in many similar ways to what we've heard the other people on the panel, sexual violence, whether one experiences it oneself personally or whether it is our friends, our neighbors, our communities, this is something that is ubiquitous for all of us and all of our lives. And certainly my own life has been really consumed by different kinds of violences, from early infancy to the present. And I guess for me and personally, the real inspiration for me to work on sexual violence, to try to come to some understanding about this sort of casual sense of sexual entitlement that so many people, and let's say so many men, have in all of our communities, has really come very much through talking to friends and families, but also, if I'm honest, it's also come very much through reading poetry, which is an unusual thing, I think, for an historian to say. But my book is full of poetry because beautiful. That really has been a central feature of my life. And the book starts with a poem by an absolutely incredible African-American poet called Wanda Coleman, and the poem is simply called Rape. 1983, she published it, and it's a story of an African-American woman who is sexually violated in her own home by two armed assailants. Her boyfriend comes home afterwards, and he's so incensed by the fact that his entitlement over her body, his exclusive entitlement over her body has been broken, that he rapes her as well. But I think that poem says something really deep to me as personally, and that is the way it ends, because the poem ends by saying, she waited until she was sure they would not return and kill. She picks up the telephone and makes the mistake of believing that the world will understand. And that poem is what made me write the book. That poem really touched me. And it is about trying to understand what is this thing called sexual violence and not only make sense of it, but, as we will be talking about today, trying to end that kind of thing within our societies.
Thanks, Joanna. Very powerful poem. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to stay with you for a second and ask you to talk then about this really interesting and I think in many ways challenging definition that you have right up front in your book about sexual violence. Can you talk that through with us?
Well, now we're going from the personal to the political and disciplinary.
It is always the personal and the political.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm an historian, so what is really interesting for me, intellectually as well as personally, is the way sexual violence changes so dramatically over time. And this is why I'm an historian, because by looking in history, we can see that things changed. Therefore, things can change again. And we can create our worlds and not simply be passive recipients to it. So, I define sexual violence with that lens in mind. So for me, sexual violence is any act that is said to be sexual and violent by any participant or onlooker. And it's a broad definition, but it's a necessary definition, because if we take a historically specific definition of sexual violence, we're going to lose some of the different ways that people in the past experienced sexual violence. Sex was differently understood in the past, violence was differently understood in the past, and I just want to encompass that whatever people think is sexual and violent, that I take that seriously and I historicize that and see how that changes over time.
So if a person names it as a violent act, then we consider it to be sexual violence or rape, regardless of what the law says. That is the implication of what your definition says.
Yeah, because the law is extreme, as we all know here, the law is extremely parsimonious in what they want to define as sexual violence. After all, the law basically doesn't want to criminalize ordinary male misbehavior. So it's extremely reluctant to admit to these sorts of things. So it is, it's fundamentally a definition that, someone who has been harmed or someone who has watched someone been harmed, we need to take seriously. And the law certainly doesn't do that.
Yeah. So Bronwyn, what do you think about that definition? That if I say it, and I experienced it, then that is what we call it. What do you think about that definition and what the implications are for women, particularly in light of what you've just said about the kind of layers of violence historically that Aboriginal women have had to deal with?
Well, I would agree with that definition. I think that's broad enough to encompass the way we would look at sexual violence. Oh goodness, I'm losing my train of thought of what I was about to say. Yes, most definitely. The definition of you feel, I know what I was going to say. Because really, this is all about power. And if you're feeling powerless in that situation, and it's a sexual situation, and you call it, or somebody notices that, then I think that's fair enough.
Yeah. So then what do we do about the law? Saxon, I'll ask you that question. Having been through a harrowing legal process, what do you think about this definition, and where does that sit with the reality of a criminal justice system that doesn't always believe women?
Well, yes, I also agree with that definition. I think that is broad enough to encapsulate so many experiences which the law cannot do, does not do, and will not do. I think it can sometimes be sort of a futile idea to try and, mould the law to fit around this very broad definition when that's not what it was built to do. It is performing exactly how it was meant to perform. So, asking it to change in this way is sometimes a very difficult ask. And so I think, this is hardly dangerous idea, I think, but we need to rebuild it from the ground up. You know, I'm hardly the first person to say this, but trying to manipulate it, which I personally do. I realise I'm calling my own struggle feeble and useless, but you know, we change as much as we can because we do exist within this structure. But can it do that? Can it be that? And I think the answer broadly is it won't. It could, I'm sure, but it won't do that. So we really need to investigate how we work around that. And of course, I think, you know, some of those ideas come from an abolitionist perspective of maybe we don't, and sort of other avenues to do that. But I think, you know, sexual violence is so nuanced and the law is not.
That's a really good point. Jess, similar question. How does this definition that Joanna puts forward square with the work you've done around domestic violence and coercive control in particular?
Yeah, I mean, everyone here is giving me so much to think about. I feel like the genuine response would just be sit here and mull. But the feeling that I have listening to all of you is, and thinking about this issue more broadly, and what Joanna said as that definition, is that the most dangerous idea in the world is to live in a world with rape, because currently we do live in a world that seems to think that there is no rape. There's just a lot of people who say they've been raped. And that thing of everyone knows someone who's been raped, but no one knows a rapist. Where are they all? And the answer is they're everywhere. I guess the thing that has astounded me, I guess particularly since Me Too, and like, is there another two-word phrase in the world that has been as dangerous as that, in terms of exploding power, is that you can have two people in a room and have two genuinely opposite accounts of what has happened. And I think the most powerful story about that came from the Aziz Ansari case, which, for those who don't know, was a pretty well-known comedian, a woman he took home with him, young woman, Grace, as she was known, talked to an online a website about basically what had happened between them. Now, it was, to read, everybody who read that had a different feeling about what had happened. It went into visceral detail. I myself see an incredible amount of disregard and coercion. Others see, well, that happens every time I go on a date. Or, well, he checked in with her a number of times and he was just, he was just trying to get something going in as respectful way as he could. She came out of that engagement thinking that she had been sexually assaulted. He came out of it thinking that he just had a consensual sexual experience, that they hadn't quite vibed right. And this is what you hear from a lot of guys, particularly since Me Too, a lot of guys who've had the courage to think back over their sexual experiences and gone, have I raped someone? Like, literally not actually knowing if that's happened. And I'm not talking about predators. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not talking about Jimmy Saviles and there is a spectrum. I'm talking about people who may have treated sex like they're a 1980s salesman where the whole thing is like, always be closing. Like, she doesn't want to do it that way, let's try it over here. What if I try this? What if I try that? She wants to buy this. She just doesn't quite know it yet, and I just haven't pitched it right. And I've talked to a lot of guys who had to really have some very uncomfortable conversations with with women they'd been out with, women that they'd gone home with and slept with, to say, like, did I violate you? That's why Saxon's work is so important.
Yeah, I think that's you're taking us into an area, this sort of grey zone, the stuff around consent, which I know you've been doing quite a lot of work around, Saxon. But I guess part of the question for me there is how it's hard to imagine a man following up years later and saying, but did it is an impossible thing for me to imagine, frankly.
They say they did it. I believe them. I'm sure it's not like widespread.
I believe that they say it. but part of what I want to get to with that response is this question about shame, because shame runs through. It's the current that kind of runs through this entire conversation about sexual violence, and one of the things that Joanna's book does really well is it talks about shame on the part of both victims and perpetrators, which is a really difficult thing to talk about. So I want us to come there, but before we get there, I just want to come back to you, Saxon, around this question about consent, that where Jess is taking us, and some of the work that you've been doing around that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think part of that, confusion around two people coming out of an experience with wildly different ideas about what happened, and then our third onlooker, as it were, also being totally conflicted, partially comes from our, total lack of education around relationships and sexuality education and what that means, but also our view of sex as this one-stop destination. I want to do this, and this is the person that is currently doing it with me right now. It's not about enjoyment. It's not about any of that. It isn't what you think sex should be if you read a Colleen Hoover book. It is a power. It is to do something to somebody, not to do something with somebody. And I think that our view of sex as this, I have to get to this end destination, and the passenger doesn't matter, and this doesn't matter, and that doesn't matter, the end destination matters, really clouds our view of how we're getting there. And so, put those two things together, and we have this recipe for disaster where people don't know how to have these conversations, don't know that they're supposed to have these conversations, or disregard the fact that they should, and then walk away and think, well, I did exactly what I was taught to do. There are grey areas, there is confusion, which is why, we say that you need to talk, you need to be in constant communication with each other to make sure that everyone's on the same page. But to do that would add a couple of extra stops, and people don't want to do that when you view sex in that way.
Yeah. Bronwyn, I want to ask you about this, because you disclosed your age as being 70, and I'm wondering about it as a generational question. So often when we have these conversations about, well, is there a gray area? What does this mean? From your sense as someone who's now 70, what do you think about how this played out for your generation? Are younger women talking more broadly about what might be sexual violence in ways that for your generation actually, that would never have been considered part of the conversation?
Most definitely. Most definitely. Those words would never be on anybody's lips. Any conversation would probably hush anyone that they happen to. The shame factor. Shame is also a way of control. It's in Aboriginal communities, shame, traditionally we didn't have jails and lockups, so certain things were used. So I'm not saying this shame often kept people from doing things they shouldn't be doing. It kept the relationships going, how you relate to somebody and what shame it is if you break those taboos with, and I'm not talking about rape here now, I'm talking about in general.
Yeah.
But, it's about the socialisation of men and women, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Socialisation of men and women. That men don't think it's wrong, that it's a chase and a game, and women can tolerate, get over it, not mention, So it's really, this is a question, not for a panel of experts who it's happened to. This, like family violence, is a thing that the whole of community, through their families, need to be engaged, because we need a whole of community change in how we view this sort of stuff. It's not for someone to take care and change things, someone else to change things. It needs to be a conversation that's in everybody's household.
Absolutely.
About how we view it and how we change it now.
Absolutely.
And I ain't saying that's going to be easier Of course it isn't. It's going to be most difficult. But certainly it's about socialisation of human beings. It seems to be all over that this type of violation is acceptable. But one thing it does remind me of is women and men who are incarcerated, who are in jail, and the rape between same-sex people in those places. Through the Women's Centre, I have a little to do with women in prison and prisons. And in the women's prison, it's almost unspoken about acceptable. So people like, you see in the films and so on, people are terrified about their first nights there and who they can pal with and where they're going to get protection from. So this is another whole area that's, just not discussed. I was down the road here one day, just down the road, and I was talking to a girl I know, a couple of girls I know. She said, what just happened to me? Because this is common practice in jail. When you go into jail, they search your internal cavities, see if you're hiding a phone or something. Can you imagine that? That's just so... If that doesn't scare people from going to jail, I don't know what will. Is that rape? We don't know. Do they get certain sexual pleasures from doing that? But this girl said it happened to her down the street from someone else who'd been in jail, another woman. So I thought I was hiding. She said, I thought I was hiding. She thought I had some drug. She thought So you know what she done? Down in front of the supermarket. Just in a matter of seconds. And I come away thinking, your body's just been violated. But is it sexual assault?
Which takes us back to the fundamental question we had with Joanna's definition, which is that as a bystander, the ability to witness and to call something out and to say, well, this is what I've just seen happening. I want to take us back to shame, Joanna, and to ask you to talk a little bit about how you cover this in your book. What is the social purpose of shame?
Yeah, just to follow up though what you said, absolutely, I think this is the real power of language and the ability of, in the case you just gave then, of bystanders to say, hang on here, what was done to you was wrong. It was a violation of your body. And to call it out as a form of sexual violence. And the other thing you said that really resonated with me, but links to this shame question, you mentioned that shame is about communities. One of, I think, the interesting things about, or many interesting things about shame, is that it is very much an interpersonal emotion or interpersonal thing. It's not like guilt. Guilt is when you think maybe you've done something wrong. Shame is when you think other people think you have done something wrong, even though you may not have done something wrong, and you may even reject that you do something wrong, but you may still feel intense shame because you're being disrespected by other people. And this is what makes shame both interesting, but also something that can be combated, because, you may, a victim survivor of sexual assault probably will feel shame in a room full of rape-denying, rape-minimalizing people, but won't feel shame in an environment of people who have experienced similar sorts of things, who are talking about it, and who are validating their experience, which links to what you're saying. So you're creating these communities where we can actually say, actually, we support what you're doing. You shouldn't feel ashamed. It's happened to us. You're not alone. It's not something that is isolating. It is something that everyone here has experienced. And that is what alleviates that sense of shame. And just very quickly as a footnote to this, because you did mention perpetrator shame, which is a difficult thing to talk about and politically controversial.
Yeah.
But a lot of men, as you're saying, don't feel shame because they don't think they've done anything wrong. But actually, some men who, particularly if it's particularly violent kinds of sexual assault, do feel shame. This is why rapists have extremely high levels of alcohol abuse, drug addiction, all those sorts of things. They actually do feel shame, but they are denying it and trying to make believe it didn't happen or fit it into some different kind of narrative.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing, I think, about shame. And if we have feminists affirming that you ought to feel shame,
Yeah.
that is actually something, I think, which
Yeah.
is positive in terms of perpetrators
Yeah.
of these acts.
Yeah.
I think it's very maybe just quickly responding to that, because I think shame ended up being it was one of the most horrific chapters of my book on domestic violence that I wrote, because actually just even writing about shame puts you in contact with your own shame, and the idea of shame is something that we like to studiously avoid. It's sort of the worst feeling that a human can possibly have. And one of the most interesting things that I started discovering about the way that people are connecting shame with violence is that shame, as James Gilligan, the clinical psychiatrist who works in American prisons, talks about, he believes shame leads to all violence, that shame is the core progenitor of violence, and that so you feel shame, but probably quite unacknowledged, deeply buried sense of shame from imposing power over and using violence, but that the need to impose that in the first place came from a position of shame. And again, deeply unacknowledged shame. And when shame is obviously, just saying, it's an essential, it was a way of community regulation before there was, the state. It is still used as a state-based form of regulation as well. But shame is something, because we are so avoidant of feeling and cannot speak openly about it, then it can, in some people, become a toxic version of that, where I am so determined not to feel this that I will make you feel it instead, which can be through sexual violence, it can be through degradation, through coercive control, through grooming. It's like, I'm going to project my inner sense of shame onto you, and you are going to carry that. And I'm going to expect you to carry that. So I think, shame is, as you said, very controversial because it's not to say, it's not as an excuse. And James Gilligan puts it so well. It's like, if we don't try to understand what is causing endemic sexual violence, family violence, violence in general, then we are not going to be able to address it. And to just condemn heart disease, you do not find the cure. And condemning violence is going to be similarly as ineffective.
Interesting. So which leads us to one of the questions that someone sent in advance. We're not going to open up for questions, but we have had some people send in questions because we didn't want to open up to triggering questions. But one of the questions someone's asked is, what are some things that men can do to support sexual violence survivors? And in part, I'm inserting this question now because the man question is a very important question when it comes to talking about and thinking about sexual violence. So anyone who wants to take this one can take it. I'm not going to assign it. So it's both about some broad reflections on the man question, and I'll leave it as open as that, and then linked to that so that we're not immediately jumping to men as solutions. What can men do? But first, let's talk about the man factor in sexual violence. How do we deal with men?
Anyone want to pick that up?
Nobody wants to answer that question.
I'll pick it up. I mean, the men factor is actually not as complex as it may sound, and that is, men can do just like what every feminist is doing, and everyone on this panel is doing. They can call out their friends. They can talk to their loved ones. They can acknowledge that they are also at risk of sexual violence. So in other words, it is not something that's exclusive to girls, women, and non-binary peoples. It is something that affects them. 1 in every 5 girlfriends of mine will be sexually assaulted in their lives. 1 in every 12 boy friends of mine, or male friends of mine, since it has a different connotation, male friends of mine will also be sexually assaulted in their lives. And these rates go up much, much higher if you look at minoritized people. So it is something that should concern boys and men. But I think the other important thing that certainly feminists of my generation failed, or many feminists of my generation failed to understand, is that boys and men want to be involved, or so many boys and men want to be involved. And I do remember a period in history, particularly 1970s and 80s, where they were deliberately and explicitly excluded from anti-rape activism. Now, thankfully, that has changed. But encouraging boys and men encouraging themselves and each other to get involved in these campaigns works to everyone's advantage.
Go ahead, Jess, and then I want to ask Bronwyn a question about this.
Just very quickly add that I think that there's calling out, and then there's also removing the shame around talking about sex in a way that's tender, man to man in male circles, but also calling out transgressions, whether that be rape or sexual assault or just really uncomfortable sexual behaviour that comes up in conversation or becomes known, in such a way that the shame is not so overwhelming that the other man decides never to talk of it again. And there's just quickly to recount, there's an ad was put about by Respect Victoria, and there's all these guys in a pub, and there's one guy, he's talking horribly to his wife, all the other guys looking at each other, feeling very uncomfortable, and then he gets off the phone, and one of the guys goes, mate, that's just not on. It's like, what? And it's like, and then the other person sort of pipes up and goes, yeah, mate, you can't talk to your wife like that. And then everyone goes back to their beers. And it's like, wow, so you've actually just humiliated that guy. You haven't given him any sense of he's going to be held in friendship to talk about why he's talking like that. Where's he going to take that sense of humiliation home? Probably to the person he was just on the phone with.
Yeah.
Who'll be a container for it.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, there's calling out, but there's also calling out from a position of love, as the great late Bell Hooks would advocate so strongly for. We have to come back to relationality and connection.
Yeah.
That's the antidote to this behaviour.
Yeah. Thanks, Jess. That's beautiful. Bronwyn, one of the issues that is so deeply troublesome is how in conversations about men and sexual violence, particularly in my community, black men, in your community, black men, are so often sexualized and racialized, so that you can't talk about sexual violence within our communities without it rapidly going to a really racist place. How do we think about that, and how do we talk about that, and how do we take that on in ways that are helpful?
Oh my goodness. I just think men have to lead, although I hate these buzzwords. It's the only one I can think of right now. Men really have to take this on and lead. As has been said for so long, the domain of solving these issues were left to women. And maybe we held on to them and tried a lot, tried really hard. And we've done a lot because we've raised it to this stage it's here now, so we've done a lot. But for black fellas, I'm like, when do men step up and take charge of this stuff? I know there's a whole, one of the things that keeps us all down, those common things that keep Aboriginal people together and often keeps us from speaking out about it. The Aboriginal women don't report violence, let alone rape, by males, by their partners, friends and boyfriends. And a lot of that's because the thing that holds us together, and a lot is racism. The kind of racism you might receive if you do report. But it's also the things that bind together because we all have that unspoken understanding of it. So they're the things that bind us together. And when women are calling out then about these issues in our community, there's a sense that you're splintering the community. We have come a long way. I think we've come past that. Probably one of the most well-known, respected men in Redfern a couple of years ago at was International Women's Day or activism, 16 days of activism against gender violence. A man, a little bit young. I knew him as a kid anyway. And he was always a good guy, but he, basically stood up and talked about his history in domestic violence. It's a start. But really, maybe I'm just old and tired, but I can't take this on. You fellas got to take this on. We have to broaden the pool of who's working with it, don't we?
We've got 5 minutes left in this conversation. It went very quickly. And I guess I want to ask each of you what the thing is going to be that we will do to live in a world without rape. And of course, there are many, many things. But what's your big number one thing, Jess, that is going to take us there or get us closer? Sorry, not Jess, Saxon.
Oh, good.
It's so hard to... all you white girls look the same.
Come on, she's got pink hair.
Sorry, Saxon. What's your one big thing?
I wish you had gone to Jess,
Yeah,
to be honest.
sorry.
But, it is really difficult. I'm looking at the time right now, so I'm going to talk really fast. But
Just ignore the timer because we have a little bit of give on the time.
it is difficult because I always say there is no silver bullet. We can change laws and we can implement comprehensive relationships and sexuality education and we can, change community attitudes. We have to do all of it. So, there is no silver bullet. But I suppose I kind of go back to what Jess was talking about. It has to come from a place of love. Whatever you're doing, it has to come from a place of love. I think, and just from my personal experience, revenge gets me nowhere, anger gets me nowhere. For me, the thing that drives my activism and my work is love, and making sure that, what am I changing this for? Am I changing it because I'm angry at someone? No, I'm changing it because I want everyone to be happy. I want everyone to have a good time. I want us all to be, just chilling out and not worrying about this one overarching thing that can change the rest of your life forever.
Thank you, Saxon. And given what we know about the experiences that you have been through, to speak from a place of love rather than revenge is a really remarkable thing, and I just want to note that, so thank you. Jess.
Yeah.
Now, Jess.
Yeah,
That
sure.
Jess.
Now I've had some time to think. Thanks, Saxon. Fully, back what Saxon's saying about modelling the alternative vision of love and relationality. I think also, and it's a very difficult conversation to have in Australia or anywhere, especially among feminists, but we have to do something about porn. It's, you can have all the relationships, education in class as you want, but just the repetitive viewing of a type of sex education which pits men's power over women, male power over female subordination, and basically depicts rape. Essentially, there's never a conversation about consent, gagging, slapping, choking, etc. is just de rigueur. I just don't know how we're going to make headway with this next generation, which we should be, with the ubiquity and access of porn at a young age, and why it should not be regulated in the same way as any other broadcast, form of broadcast.
Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, I've got a whole chapter on what we can do.
I know, and it's a great chapter.
There are actually two things I want to emphasize, though. I think the first is local, and that is we have to work on our local areas, what we know, what we understand. You know, local, small, so-called small local change can have global, huge impact. And it can't be outsourced, so we have to do it ourselves. So I think locality and local is important. The second thing I think is important is diversity, which is meant in a huge number of ways. I think in two ways in particular. First, in terms of personnel, and we've discussed this about getting boys and men involved, getting a full range of our communities involved, but also in terms of strategies. That we need, there's no one answer, as we've just heard. There are a lot of different strategies, and each of us are positioned in particular ways. We have particular spheres of influence, we have particular talents and skills, and we ought to be using that in as many ways as possible. And I think the overarching thing, though, for me personally, what I argue strongly for is actually a feminism based on difference, not on similarities, because a sort of universalist understanding of sexual violence is disguised ethnocentricity. And you mentioned pornography. There is nothing that is going to unite an anti-porn feminist with a sex-positive feminist. We have to acknowledge that and unite over what we want to change, while still, of course, fighting our wars. You may want less pornography, I want better pornography. But
Oh, no, I do.
we can still...
Walk away all you like. Just don't, do it in the way that we're currently experiencing.
But those diversity of strategies, I think, is really, really important, with difference being emphasized the whole time. Transversalism.
Well, I guess if you hear Aboriginal community people speaking, elders or wherever they are, we have conversations, respect is often a word that comes up a lot. And I think I'm going to take a deeper dive into respect, because in a way it's the opposite of shame. Shame is because you're not getting respected, whether it be for the male who's done it, they know they're not going to get respect for being a rapist, or the person that it's been done to, feeling that they'll lose face, whatever you like to call it. So I think I'm going to try, in the ways that I can, I guess, is to try and broaden the conversations around respect and reflect that is the opposite to shame, and try to develop those conversations further in the communities and the areas that I move in or can influence.
Thanks, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful place to end. Thank you all so much. We have solved the problem of rape. I just want to say, I want to close out by an Alice Walker quote that I love, which says, "Pay attention to the present you are constructing. It should look like the future you are dreaming." Thank you all very much.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.